Spotlighting Hawaii's leaders.
We want to bring in Governor David E.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Lieutenant Governor, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. Mayor Derek Kawakami.
Thank you so much, Senator, for being here.
Spotlighting the issues.
Where is the virus right now in our community?
How much is this overall going to cost the state?
How are you responding to the community's concerns? Talk about the level of citations that you guys are writing.
Spotlight Hawaii with Yanji Denise and Ryan Kalei Suji on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Longstrugs and Beachside Roofing.
Aloha and a good Wednesday morning to all of you joining us live here on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. I'm Yanji Denise, joined by Ryan Kalei Suji. Ryan, we've got a double header this morning and we are delving into the world of politics.
That's right. We've been speaking to the candidates running or seeking the office of Lieutenant Governor. And joining us this morning is former state senator and candidate for Lieutenant Governor Jill Tokuda. Good morning. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
You know, you were one of the first to announce that you were running for this office, and this is actually a seat that you sought and ran after 4 years ago. What ultimately led you to the decision to want to run again this term and this cycle?
You know, it wasn't an easy decision. We've spent the last 4 years really working hard, continuing to make sure we support families, the work I've been doing with nonprofit organizations and foundations, helping people through the pandemic, helping the state track the billions of dollars of federal money coming in. But it really all boiled down to the fact that at the end of the day, I sat down at the kitchen table right behind me with our children and had dinner and looked around. And it was the same thing that led me to first run for Lieutenant Governor 4 years ago, our kids. The fact that, especially given what we've been experiencing the last 2 years, as we look at our families, my boys, really having to wonder and worry about whether there will be a future for them here in Hawaii, that we are doing everything possible that we can, not just talking, but really doing things to make sure that they can see a future for themselves in this place we call home. And that takes action, that takes everyone rolling up their sleeves, stepping up. And that led me to my decision to throw my hat back in again and run. You know, there's been much that I've been able to do from outside of government. But having someone in the executive branch that understands what it's like to be a government decision maker, but also what it's like to be on the other side of the table, that's critical. That's an important perspective. And so we're back at it. It's exciting, and it's going to be a great 2022.
Let's talk a little bit about that office. What do you see as that role? Because it really does depend on the person who's in the seat, what that job ultimately becomes. So how do you see the role of Lieutenant Governor?
You know, that's a great question. Well, it always comes up when I talk to people. You know, it really should be about co-leading our state. And while that's not defined in law as such, it means that you've got to have somebody that can come in and understands government, has the relationship and the willpower and the know-how to get things done, and can move with the governor and the executive administration, all the departments, to really make sure that people get what they need. Communities, businesses are supported. And so it takes somebody who has that know-how to be in that seat and the will, quite frankly, to get things done. You know, when I look at that office, though, I really feel it's something that needs to be brought in and defined more clearly so that we're not just asking candidates every 4 years for Lieutenant Governor, hey, what will you do and will you get along with the governor? And when you look at other states, California and others, their Lieutenant Governor is actually the Senate President or the chair of the Public Lands Commission or the Secretary of State. And so even 4 years ago, I had really pushed that we have to add some real teeth and definition to the position. For example, I've suggested making the Lieutenant Governor the chair of the Board of Education. 25% of our state budget and impacted, you know, throughout the community. Everyone's touched in some way, whether they be a parent, they be alumni, or their workers come from our schools. And so, you know, really adding some accountability and some authority to the position, I think, is critical, not just for whomever steps in the seat next, but going forward as well. So I think that's really critical that we really start to look at making the LG position a true co-leader in government, because as we've seen, you really need everybody pitching in to really be able to help move our state, whether we're in a pandemic or not.
You know, prior to when you were in the state Senate, you chaired the Ways and Means Committee. So you obviously have a very intimate knowledge of the state budget and understand a lot of the finer details with that. There are others who are seeking this office that do not have any government experience and have not been in the world of politics. Do you think that your background is a benefit, or do you see where people may resonate towards those who have never been in government before?
That's a great question. And I really do think that that is a critical juncture that we're at in this state. I do believe that my experience as Ways and Means Chair, Education Chair, Equine Affairs Chair is going to be really critical, considering the things that we need to do to rebuild back better our state. And, our homes and our communities here. At the same time, and I don't think people really realize this, but I have extensive experience before I was in office and now after being in office in the private sector, running a small business, being a nonprofit executive, really understanding, again, what it's like to have to live by the decisions of government and what that means for real people at the end of the day. And so I think being able to have experience from both sides of that table is critical, because the reality is government alone will not rebuild Hawaii to where we need to be. And that's not just getting back to where we were before the pandemic, because the reality is before the pandemic, we left too many people behind. Businesses were struggling. We've got to build back better and stronger. And that's really going to take somebody who's understand what it's like to live on both sides of those aisles. And I really do feel that that's a benefit that I bring, being somewhat of a hybrid, if you will, of a candidate that's been in office, but the reality is spent many, many years in the private sector, being on that other side of the table too.
Let's talk about the other side of the table. Tell us a little bit more in detail about what you've been up to since the last time you were in government.
That's thank you for that question. And it's definitely been busy for everyone. I think one of the positive things we've seen from this pandemic, these last crazy 2.5 years, is everyone just stepping up and doing everything they can to support our families and our communities, and have been very blessed to work with foundations and nonprofit organizations to be able to do just that, whether it was working to make sure that we support our local farmers, but take those produce and put them into food baskets. Those are programs that I've done, and working with other foundations to help link people up with rent and utility to support, to make sure that people aren't finding themselves homeless at the end of the day during such a difficult time. And as I mentioned before, also with the state being on the receiving ends of record-breaking numbers of federal dollars coming in, well over $20 billion, making sure that for those funds that had a short lifetime, making sure that we were tracking them, making sure we were spending them, and also understanding how we were spending them to better make decisions to put those resources where it's needed most. And I think, all of those functions during these last 2 years have been really critical in both working with the nonprofit, private sector side, but also understanding and working with government as well. At the end of the day, making just sure that it was about getting resources and help to people who needed most. And that's really what my business and the work that I've been doing has been for the last 2 years, and really reflective, again, of the different kinds of experiences that I do bring to the table.
This has become a crowded field of those who are seeking this race. And again, this is your second time around running for this office. You fell just short the first time around. Of course, coming in just behind our current Lieutenant Governor, Josh Green. What is different this time around? What have you learned maybe going into this race? And how do you campaign during a time of COVID where there's so much restrictions in place, and there aren't many opportunities for you to do as much face-to-face contact? But what are some of the lessons learned heading into this for you?
I love that, because one thing I reinforce to my kids all the time is, mommy didn't give up. We lost. And when you lose, when you fall down, the one thing you have to then do is look yourself in the mirror and reflect. What are the lessons that I learned? What can I do better next time? What did we do wrong? And I really think that it was a humbling experience in 2018, but a wonderful one, to be able to see the issues we care about elevated. And over the last 4 years, become even more important in terms of taking care of our families, making sure that while we are very expensive here in Hawaii, record inflation going on, at the end of the day, how are we making sure people and businesses can survive here at home? And, one of the big lessons and takeaways that came from the 2018 election was, we're all busy, but we have to stop and pause and take the time to listen and to learn and engage with people. And that's what I've been doing for months now, if not longer, is really going throughout our communities, every little community you can find, often because of COVID, talking to one or two people at a time in socially distant, appropriate settings, and just really getting to understand the struggles, but also the hopes that people have for our community. And I think that is the most important thing that we can do right now, is we can listen, and then we can really start to figure out how we get to work together. So have been embarking on kitchen table conversations, and it doesn't mean it's just in a kitchen table, but I was sitting on a lanai yesterday. I've sat in a round table pizza with a couple of people. I've sat in little coffee shops. To me, those conversations that we have, like the ones we have with our family, are critically important to understand and really feel where people are at, and then be able to work together to figure out what we need to do next to really make those dreams happen, and really address the struggles and the challenges that people are facing. And so I think in a time of COVID, campaign becomes extremely difficult. But I think for me, the exciting part is it becomes more personal. It means that we're having more individualized conversations. It means that we're really starting to reach out. And I think COVID has made us all much more honest, much more open to talking about our situations in ways that I think we didn't before. It's not as pretty as it looks on Instagram. Life is tough. Life is raw. And I think COVID's allowed all of us to really talk about the struggles that we also have. When we start talking about it, we can really start to get to work on making things better.
You referenced your kids a couple of times, and I'm interested to know, as a parent, how you feel the state is doing when it comes to reopening schools with the Omicron variant. Do you agree with the way things have gone? Do you think there should be more testing? There have been calls, perhaps, for the DOE or the state to hand out better high-quality masks. Do you think that there's more that can be done on the mitigation front to protecting kids right now? I know I personally hear from a lot of parents who are genuinely worried.
It's really been tough for parents, and I can tell you this, before the kids were back in school for in-person learning, I had a real worry about the learning loss that our kids were experiencing. Not to say that distance learning wasn't a great option while we were in a place where there were no vaccinations, and there was definitely a lot of concern about that. But what I could see in my own children was a significant learning loss taking place. And for me as a parent, there was a lot of guilt that I couldn't do more to also be a teacher and help them navigate through a distance learning environment. So I continue to worry about the kind of learning loss that our children, especially our little ones, have seen over the last 2.5 years. I think we can always do better to try to keep things safe, and provide resources where necessary. And, but at the same time, in-person learning, as much to the extent that it's possible from a safety perspective, that is first and foremost the best way to keep our children learning, engaged. And this is not just from an academic perspective, but socially and emotionally. These are environments that we want our children to be in right now. So how can we, as the adults in the room, also make it a safe place for children, for our teachers, for the staff at the schools as well? And whether that be testing kids, whether it be additional masks and procedures, we have to take every step possible to make sure that they're both safe, but at the same time that the learning and the connections continue. So as a parent, I'm definitely worried, but we are continuing to send our 2 boys to school, 6th and 8th grade. Can't believe that they're this age already. Time has gone too fast. But having them in front of a teacher, interacting with peers in a safe, socially distant way, I have seen the difference between that and them being full and distance learning. So I think it's incumbent on all of us, parents, teachers, staff, community, and students themselves, to really step up and make sure we work together to keep it both an environment that's safe and where learning takes place.
As we close out here, our time with you, wanted to provide you just a final message that you may have for those out there who are just getting to know you, or your message out there for those who are still trying to decide on what candidate to support during this race.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for this opportunity as well to be able to speak with you and your viewers. For myself, I know it's definitely a crowded field. And it's a quick race to the primary election, but my message really is, I'm here to listen, I'm here to learn, and really figure out how we're going to work together, not just talk about things, but work together to get things done. And I'm looking forward to being out there in as socially distantly acceptable way as possible in every corner of this community, because I understand that you've really got to be present You've really got to develop relationships to understand what people are feeling and what people need. And that's what we need in government right now. People who understand the hopes and the struggles and the dreams of people in our community, the perspective of families. You know, as a working mother myself, as someone who's had to juggle 2 children, a business, and at one point even being in office, it's the same struggles we all have and the same worries we have for our families. How do we take that and how do we build back even stronger than we were before? And these are the kinds of conversations that I really want to have with all of you. More so, again, listening and learning to what you think we need to do to make Hawaii the place that we want it to be. So thank you again for this opportunity. I'm really excited to be traveling across the state. Was in Kona yesterday. Who knows where my feet will find me tomorrow. But thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. Jill Tokuda, candidate for Lieutenant Governor. We will welcome you back in a few months. And until then, stay safe. And thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Take care.
And thank her for being here. And now we want to get to Colin Moore, UH professor and political analyst. Colin, tell us what you thought about what you heard.
You know, I think that Jill Tokuda is doing something very interesting, which is her brand is working families. I mean, this is someone who has tremendous public sector experience, was in the state Senate, but you heard her again and again emphasize her nonprofit background, her work with, budget analysis. She mentioned her kids, her family, and I think she's trying to pivot a little bit away from that public sector experience. A lot of the issues she's emphasized on her campaign website are related to kids, preschool, career pathways. So I think that's becoming her brand in this campaign. And I think that's pretty smart given the other folks in the campaign. And this helps her a little bit differentiate herself from Sylvia Luke, who might be one of her bigger competitors because on paper, they have a very similar profile.
When you hear from her, of course, she ran for this same seat 4 years ago, and she talked about some of the lessons learned. Ultimately, do you think that campaign structure and having run for this office in the past will be a benefit for her?
Absolutely. I mean, she's the only candidate who has run a statewide race before, and it's very hard to get that organizational structure in place, as you just said, Ryan. So that gives her a big advantage. Remember, she only lost to Josh Green by about 3 percentage points. She was very close to winning that race. And actually, if you look at how the polls were trending right before the election last time, her share of the vote, or at least share of the support, was increasing. So that gives her a huge advantage going into this, because she's done this before and she has that organizational infrastructure in place.
A major story, of course, that affects the race for governor, the race for lieutenant governor. Of course, today, the top headline on the Advertiser right now, 3 former top Honolulu city officials turn themselves into the FBI as part of the Kealoha probe. We saw Managing Director Roy Amamiya, former Corp Counsel Donna Leong, and former Honolulu Police Commission Chairman Max Sword, all in the custody of federal agents at this hour. Tell us your thoughts just on that development and how it could affect the race for LG and the race for governor.
Well, I think there's a lot of people who have suspected this was probably coming eventually, given what we've heard about these investigations. But now that it's actually happened, it really does start to change the political environment, particularly around, as you said, Kirk Caldwell's campaign. These are 3 of the people, at least 2 of them, Donna Leong, Roy Amamiya. I mean, Roy Amamiya really was the second person in Honolulu Hale. It's hard for me to imagine how Kirk Caldwell will still be able to run for governor with this hanging over his campaign. I mean, these were folks, at least 2 of them, who were quite close to him. And so I think this is going to be a real challenge, and it does upset the dynamics of the gubernatorial race for sure.
In looking at this race for LG, we've talked about it when we've had you on in the past, but is there a clear front runner as we head into this 2022 campaign, being early, of course, in January? But is there any indication of anyone that has the upper hand or advantage through campaign finances or any other measure that may suggest that there's one candidate ahead of the other?
At this point, I'd say no. This is a very crowded race. Different candidates have different advantages, right? We just talked about how Jill Tokuda had done this before. Some candidates like Sylvia Luke really have a lot of money. I mean, others like Tokuda have been fundraising pretty aggressively. So each candidate, I can see a path to victory. I've said before that I thought that Sherry Minor McNamara might have the hardest time because she probably has the least name recognition and the least experience in politics. You think of Keith Amemiya, he's the last person to run a big race when he ran for the mayor of the city and county of Honolulu. So I can see a way for each of them to run. At this point, if I were forced to pick two candidates who I think probably have some sort of lead, I would say it's Keith Amemiya and Jill Tokuda, just because they probably have the most name recognition going into this.
Keith Amemiya, of course, is the cousin of Roy Amemiya. He did a lot of work during the mayoral race to sort of distance himself, knowing that there was this sort of cloud over this whole situation. Do you think that today's developments with this, these arrests, do you think that affects Keith Amemiya's chances for LG?
It probably does. I mean, it's not fair that it does because we're talking about two different people. But I think in the minds of voters, they probably will be connected to some degree. And so I think he's going to have to do that work to distance himself yet again.
Looking ahead at some other things that are happening that could impact the election, of course, reapportionment has become somewhat of an issue with just what's happening with the commission and these lines being redrawn yet again. How do you think overall, the reapportionment will impact this election, and your thoughts on the process that is currently underway?
Well, boy, this was one of the most controversial reapportionment experiences I've seen. And there was really two big issues. One was just the way they drew the lines. So there was a lot of controversy based on the lines in East Oahu, connecting really District 51, which is Hawaii Kai and Waimanalo, drawing those two communities into the same districts. There was tremendous blowback. Now we have another development, which is they're going to extract 100,000 non-permanent resident military and college students. That number's up from 71,000, which was the number they used before. So that sort of means they have to start over to some degree because Hawaii Island is going to get another House seat, which means one has to be removed from Oahu. I've heard that the seat they're targeting to remove is probably Sylvia Luke's seat because she's not going to run for re-election. We don't really know exactly how it's going to affect these legislative races, particularly the House races, because we haven't seen the final maps yet. Those haven't been voted on. There was a lot of controversy before about drawing some incumbents into the same districts. I don't know if they're going to end up doing that when they produce the final maps, because again, like I said, the Oahu maps will have to be redrawn because they have a new number for extraction.
We are a week away from the start of the legislative session. We had the House and Senate leadership on this program, and they both talked about how they think that the governor's budget puts too much into the rainy day fund and that a lot of that money should be spent. Now, the governor pushing back, saying that the federal government is not going to come back with that kind of money that we saw over the last 2 years. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that budget fight.
Well, I mean, the first thing is this is in some ways great news. This is a good problem to have. We have the highest tax collections that are projected, about $8 billion in the state's history. So how this money, how this $1 billion that really they're debating over is going to be spent, is a good problem to have. Governor Ige has often been more fiscally conservative than the legislative leadership. You saw that in the darkest days of the state's economic crisis related to COVID. I think the governor has a good point that maybe tourism could collapse again. We might need that money. But of course, the legislative leaders, the entire legislature will be up for re-election, and they really need to produce. And there were a lot of disappointed progressives last session, that felt they didn't give enough support to social services or Hawaii's most needed families. So I think there's going to be a lot of legislative pressure, as you've already seen from Senate President and the Speaker, to tackle problems like homelessness with those extra funds rather than to put it into a rainy day account. And I expect the legislative leadership will probably win that battle.
With this being Governor Ige's final year in office and his final legislative session working with members of the House and Senate, how do you think this being his last year will impact anything moving forward? Oftentimes when we see these leaders heading into their last year, many of them want to leave behind some sort of key landmark deal, or whether it be a piece of legislation? Do you see anything like that happening from the Ige administration? And your overall thoughts as he enters into this final chapter of his governorship?
That's a great question, Ryan. What will be Governor Ige's legacy? I mean, we know the things that are sort of closest to his heart, which are often pretty technical details of government, reforming our IT infrastructure, things like that. I expect you're going to see some emphasis there. What is Governor Ige's legacy going to be? I think that, although he's been criticized and although he often has had pretty low approval ratings, I think when people reflect on the Ige administration, they will end up giving him a fair bit of credit for making some tough calls early in this pandemic, particularly to effectively shut down the tourism industry. He is cautious, but I think when people reevaluate his administration, they will value that caution.
Lastly, I know we're almost out of time, but I want to get your thoughts again on the news, that the developments today. Kirk Caldwell was obviously not leading this race. We know that Josh Green really has the lion's share right now. When you look at who's sort of leading, and we've talked about it before. You yourself have said it's his to lose. Does today's developments knock Caldwell out of this race, or do you think he still has a chance?
I think it does knock him out of this race. I mean, he was not a strong contender to begin with, and having the FBI arrest two very close, colleagues, that is very difficult to recover from. I mean, even if he were polling very well, it would be difficult to recover from. So I don't see a path to victory for Kirk Caldwell at this point, and it wouldn't surprise me if he decided not to run.
Okay, Colin Moore, thank you so much for taking time yet again to share your thoughts on this, of course, candidate Jill Tokuda, but also what's happening in the world of politics. Things are beginning to heat up, and I think it's only going to get a little more heated as we head on into this primary election in August. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Aloha.
Thank you. Aloha. Always great to hear his perspective. You heard him there saying that this is going to be very difficult for Kirk Caldwell to overcome the developments, of course, today, those three top officials turning themselves into the FBI. Going back to the first part of our conversation, interesting to hear from Jill Tokuda, and really how, as Colin pointed out, she is sort of pivoting a bit to pull away from the pure public service biography that she's had and focused on what she did before she was a lawmaker and in the last 2 years since leaving the State House, and talking more about being a mom, working with the private sector, and kind of bringing those worlds all together.
And we did see her during the pandemic as well. She mentioned a number of times helping to facilitate the federal dollars that came in from the government, working with nonprofit that really helped to, that worked hand in hand, I should say, with the state leadership to decide where that money was going and how it was being distributed in a timely manner. She, of course, used maybe her background in that leading the Senate Ways and Means Committee and having a knowledge of all those fine-tuned nuances that go on with budget and finance, and using that to her advantage in that area as well. We also heard from her and her ideas of what she thinks that this role of lieutenant governor would look like if she had the opportunity to serve in that capacity, saying that she would look for this to have a little more teeth and be a position that was a little more clearly defined than it currently is.
Yeah, that was very interesting to see it. She sees it as a co-leadership position and perhaps having more defined roles as opposed to it just sort of depending on the personality and the strength of the person who wins that seat. Very interesting to hear from her. Next month, we will be hearing from another person who's interested in obtaining that seat, and that is Sylvia Luke. She is currently a lawmaker, and she is going to be joining us here next month. Coming up on Friday, we are heading over to Maui to hear from Mike Victorino.
Yeah, a lot happening there on the island of Maui as some of the regulations change, as well as we see these case counts continue to go up. We haven't heard from the Maui mayor on this program in some time, so looking forward to getting an update on how things are going over there on the Valley Island. We thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. We'll see you right back here on Friday for another episode of Spotlight Hawaii. Aloha.
Aloha.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Longstrugs and Beachside Roofing.